Yeah, this is Bob Adams with Housing Virginia. Let me say a couple of words and introduce our panelists this morning. And thank you all for joining. We have over 100 people registered for this webinar. So obviously it's a subject that is of some considerable interest here in Virginia and elsewhere. Just a word about Housing Virginia. Most of you on the call probably know about Housing Virginia. We are a statewide housing research, policy, data organization, been around for 15 years. Our mission is to expand access to affordable housing across the Commonwealth, and we do that in a variety of ways. Pre-COVID, we used to do a lot of local meetings and bring people together to discuss housing programs and policies. Last year, some of you may have attended our Housing X event, which was about the future of affordable housing, where we looked at all kinds of innovation that's happening in the development of affordable housing in the state. We are hoping, health conditions permitting, to do a second Housing X next spring here in Richmond, and maybe look forward to seeing some of you here face to face for that. I would encourage all of you who are not familiar with Housing Virginia to just visit our website, housingvirginia.org, and you'll find a lot of really useful information, a lot of data, accurate, up-to-date information about housing needs and housing programs and initiatives. And also we do a weekly blog, which is of interest and that ties into why we're doing this webinar today. I'll mention that in a minute. But you can, on the website, sign up to get our weekly blog as well. A couple of months ago in that blog, we highlighted the Alley Flats initiative in Austin, Texas. Alley Flats is an ADU program, an interesting, unique ADU program. And we had a really big response to that blog that told us that there is real interest in this topic around the state. At the same time, my city, Richmond, is exploring the potential to introduce ADU ordinance. And Norfolk has an ADU ordinance, many jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, a number of other jurisdictions around the state. So it is happening here in Virginia, and we are hopeful that today's presentation will help to maybe inspire and expand that trend. So we have 4 presenters here today. I'm not going to do a lengthy introduction. You all registered from the on the website and saw the information about our presenters, but just briefly, we have Max Pastore, who's a senior associate urban planner, urban designer with RHI up in the District of Columbia. Max lives in Alexandria. He is involved in landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning. And I've had the pleasure of serving on a panel with him 6 months ago, in which he did a great presentation about ADUs, including a personal angle on it, which I know you're going to find interesting. Michelle Winters is with us. She's the executive director of Alliance for Housing Solutions, which is a nonprofit, works to increase the supply of affordable housing in Arlington and Northern Virginia. Michelle has a long and illustrious career in affordable housing policy at the national level. We have the privilege of having her on our board at Housing Virginia, so great to have Michelle with us today. Nicole Joslin was our Austin connection with Alley Flats Initiative. Nicole's the executive director of Community Powered Workshop in Austin. She's an architect. She has a diverse professional academic background in architecture development, disaster recovery, and in particular, community engaged design. And so she's going to talk about the Alley Flats Initiative, but also about how they got there and how community input is a key element of this type of program and really any affordable housing program. And then finally, Dr. Tina Stacy is a research associate at the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. She specializes in urban economics and inclusion, and she's also been very much engaged in ADU policy development and is currently working with the city of Alexandria in Northern Virginia on an ADU initiative. So that's a panel. We're going to take about 15 minutes per presentation, and we'll just slide from one presentation to the next. I'm not going to do interruptions between those. And I think all of you who are on the call have done this before, so please use the chat to put questions up. We're going to wait until the end. We'll do presentations that'll last for maybe an hour, and then we'll have hopefully a half an hour or so to get to questions. I know you all will have a lot of questions. Put them in the chat. We'll keep up with them, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. And we are going to end promptly at 11. If we don't get to all the questions, we may be able to answer some of those later offline and make those available on the website. This presentation is being recorded. We will post it on the Housing Virginia website within a couple days, and we'll also post the presentations from all of the panelists. So that said, and a special shout out to Tina Stacy, who lost power this morning, but is heroically doing her presentation from her phone. So hopefully that will all work out well. And so with that, let me turn it over to you, Max, and have at it, and you are on the clock.
I just wanted to be clear really quickly to use the Q&A function and not the chat function for questions. Thanks, guys.
Q&A function, I am sorry.
Just about to share my screen. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Max Pastore. Bob did a great job introducing myself. I am an urban designer, as he mentioned, at RHI. So I love the built environment, constantly working with it, and do a lot of work in Alexandria, Northern Virginia, East Coast, District of Columbia area. I'm a DC homeowner as of about 2017 or so, and I recently built a backyard ADU that my dad just moved into a few months ago, just before the pandemic. So I'm going to quickly introduce ADUs to folks who don't have a good comprehensive understanding of them. Very briefly, they're basically secondary living units within that have separate entrances, etc., within single family zoned parcels, generally speaking, at least in the DC and Virginia area. The placement of those units, the sizes, the occupancy, parking requirements, all of that stuff really varies a lot across jurisdictions, but mostly always exclude tiny homes on wheels. A big question that always comes up, at least for me when I was looking into this. Generally located, these units are located within basements within the main house, can be in a converted garage as a secondary kind of existing structure, or like what I did, you can build a new detached structure in your backyard, which is that photo in the back that you see over there. So why exactly did I build an ADU in my backyard? Three things mainly. The first was I really wanted my dad to be close by. He's retired, getting older. Wanted to make sure that we had ability to look at him or look after him, those sort of things. Being a planner in DC and urban designer in the DC area, the housing crisis is constantly on my mind. I wanted to try to do my best and trying to contribute to making it slightly better. And I wanted to build equity in my home just for the long term generally. Of course, I was inspired to build this ADU by my profession. DC's by right ADU zoning helped a lot to motivate me. But, you know, I really must say that despite my profession and all that, there's a lot of growing interest and media about ADUs across the nation that really kind of sparked my interest and probably convinced me the most to build this ADU. But was my family on board with this? Regardless of what my interests were, yes, luckily enough, that's true. My dad was very open to the idea, loved the idea. My husband, Jack, also very excited about the idea. So with all that said, I made a lot of trips to DC's permitting agency, or DCRA, starting in 2018, just to kind of figure out what I could and could not do in my lot. Decided with, between their feedback and some feedback from various different modular building companies across the nation, to build what is that red box on this site plan. The main house that I live in right now, that I'm talking to you from, is right here. And we decided to build a 280 square foot detached unit, which is just the absolute smallest unit size you can do in DC legally. So made a lot more visits to the permitting agency, of course. But after 5 months of reviews, 3 permit revisions, adding fire sprinklers per DC code, providing some soil erosion plans, and a lot of other things, I did get my permit. It was not the most fun of processes, and it would have been tough had I not had a background in planning and architecture, but we were able to start construction in May of 2019. But this is basically what we were working with before we built anything. So to give you an idea, so we have a small lot in DC, and we bought a flipped house in 2017. So while they did some nice things on the inside, the exterior had a lot to be desired, and was a good reason to build an ADU. Really improved our property quite a bit. So here's the construction process, digging the trenches. You can see the utility line that's directly to our house. It does not have separate utility connections to the street. We worked with a modular company out of Colorado. So once everything was ready in the warehouse, we pulled it together pretty quickly with our contractor. Here you go, kind of seeing it progress. Added a deck. We added some access, of course, to the front yard. This is the main street, you can see in that image, and the unit itself kind of faces the side. So it has a really sort of private entry sequence that goes between our main house and our property line to the main street. This is the interior. Nothing really special about the construction. It's pretty traditional, what we ended up doing, standard stick build. And here's the progression of the interior as well. Try to keep things bright, light, airy. Very important to have, for the architects of the room, to have lots of light, especially in small spaces. 280 square feet can be tight, especially when it's dark. This is what it looked like when we wrapped up, just before my dad moved in, just before the pandemic. I haven't taken any new photos of the interior since he's moved in, of course, because of the pandemic, but I did take a couple photos a few days ago to show basically how our exterior is coming along. We've been able to landscape a bit in the spring, and some of the ground cover is starting to slowly progress. But generally, my takeaways in terms of my own experience is that really ADUs are a great solution. I support them wholeheartedly. They work really well in competitive, expensive real estate markets for single family homes. DC is a good example of that. They're really well suited for young folks, singles, retirees, and really helpful for multi-generational living, which is exactly what we're doing with my dad. This, I think that the area in red is starting to change even since we finished our permitting, but we did experience situations with DC's permitting where a lot of permit reviewers had actually never reviewed an ADU application, and so therefore would use a lot of the wrong references or kind of hold it up to the same standards of more traditional multifamily style housing, which was not convenient for us. And a lot of contractors have really never built detached ADUs in the DC area. It's hard to find folks who will do it. But most importantly, I think right now is that because of the pandemic, we've noticed surprisingly that it really is a good solution for my dad, who's older, at high risk for COVID-19. We're able to allow him to socially distance in his unit, but it doesn't create a sense of social isolation, which is what he would probably experience where he was previously in a larger apartment complex and closer to downtown DC. And it allows us to consolidate errands. We can still have socially distanced activities, on Sundays for breakfast and things like that on our back deck that we built. So it's really quite helpful. Current hurdles, a lot of the other panelists will kind of speak to this more, but generally financing, permitting, unclear marketing all kind of contributes to a challenging construction process, particularly for those who don't have a lot of experience with architecture, built environment planning. And for Virginia jurisdictions, just generally as a conclusion, as my final slide, really, I would encourage you to consider doing by right ADUs. It's not a fix-all solution, but it really can help as a more market and driven way to combat the supply problem. Try to simplify permitting if possible. Consider that ADUs are not the same as single-family homes, and that maybe they shouldn't be held to exactly the same standards. Perhaps consider pre-approved designs that you work with your communities to get, so that way you can, if a homeowner wants to just get a unit design, they can build it, and it's pretty straightforward. They don't have to go through a lot of reviews. And consider developer-built ADUs, whether it's part of a larger project or as kind of one by one flipping of houses, can help to balance out the housing stock a little bit. And with that, I will wrap it up.
Hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Winters. I'm with the Alliance for Housing Solutions in Arlington. And I'm going to talk to you about what it took to get a jurisdiction in Arlington through several rounds of inclusion of accessory dwellings in our local zoning ordinances. So first, I wanted to just talk really briefly about why we were doing this. We saw multiple reasons for doing it. Max's story is a really, really good explanation of that personal reason to do it, to have somebody that you know, love, want to be by closer to you without actually sharing your own living space. So housing for a family member. Sometimes, people talk about a service provider for aging in place if you have a home for a nursing aide to be living in. And it can also, if you're renting that unit, can provide a source of income for people that some people find really valuable and important, particularly if they themselves are on fixed incomes. But that's not the only perspective to look at it. We looked at it from a community perspective, and accessory dwelling units for us in Arlington were really seen as a form of gentle density or invisible density to expand the housing supply. In these tight markets, there's lots of different possible solutions for trying to add housing to the housing supply in order to deal with our affordability crunch. And this is one way that we could do that. And it allowed us to do it in a variety of neighborhoods throughout the county in single family areas that otherwise would not be providing this type of, or this scale of unit to live in. So places where the entire community is made up of 3 to 5 bedroom single family homes, you could fit in some smaller 1-bedroom apartments either inside the homes or in the backyard. And so we saw that as a nice way to provide additional housing options in more places. And because they're smaller sizes, more affordable opportunities in those places. So the really big picture of the stages that Arlington went through are basically what you see here. We started in 2008, and actually 2008 was the year that the process became official, but it had been a couple of years before that, committees of housing commissioners and others getting together and meeting regularly and talking about what everybody was doing across the country, learning, doing research, talking about what was appropriate in Arlington. They produced a proposal, and then it went through a very, very, very kind of intense community process. It was, the idea was popular amongst those who knew a lot about housing, but it was not popular at the time in 2008 among those who were living in many of the communities that these would be able to be. And I think there was a lot of lack of understanding. There was a lot of assumptions that people were making, that it was going to change their neighborhoods, that they were going to have strangers coming through their communities. And that was going to be something that was undesirable. So there were a lot of people that pushed back on it. So what ended up happening is we only allowed at that time in 2008, and I'll show you the details of this in a minute, we allowed people to create what are known as internal ADUs. So creating an apartment in your home, and I show the graphic here for example, in an attic, in an attached addition, down in part of your first floor or your basement. Those kind of things were allowed back in 2008. And then we had 20 of them done in the following decade. So we knew we had done something wrong. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And we took another whack at it in 2017 and another whack at it in 2019. And today we now allow everything that you see here, internal, full basements, new and existing detached construction of ADUs. So this is the big picture of that. But the thing about ADUs, and I don't know if might be the only one that's going to get into this level of detail, is that that really let me get my things. Sort of the devil is in the details when it comes to an ADU policy for a community. And so you can see the phases that we went through again here. Back in 2008, because there was really a desire to do something, but there was so much fear and so much pushback at the community level. What ended up happening is Arlington allowed accessory dwelling units essentially in name, but put so many restrictions on them that it became really difficult to do. So even though they could say that accessory dwellings were allowed and some were happening, they were really not very practical for most homeowners to be able to do. And so, a couple of the examples, and by the way, they did allow them at that time by right. So there was no special permitting or approvals needed to do other than building code permits. So this was a by right situation, but again, a by right with a lot of buts. So you need to have a certain size. You need to submit an affidavit on every single tenant that moves into the space. You need to have the doors and the stairs in specific places and not in other specific places. You can't do detached. At the time, you see the red ones at the bottom. These were the worst ones that we eventually got rid of. But you had to wait for a year. You had to live in your home for a year before you could apply to have an accessory dwelling in that home. You couldn't have certain home occupations in that accessory dwelling. So this was particularly difficult to say the least, but they actually limited contractor businesses from locating within the homes because people were afraid that the contractors would park their work trucks on the streets. And they also had limits on the lot size. So no matter what size your lot was, if it didn't conform, if your lot size didn't conform to your zone, this is a typical zoning thing. If it's non-conforming, you can't do something. Or if it's not 50 foot wide, you can't do something. And on top of all of those expectations, then they said, we're still so afraid of this that we're going to put a cap of 28 units, 28 permits per year. So that it just won't go gangbusters and ruin the county. And so with all of those requirements put in place, all of those fears that were sort of documented in the ordinance, again, the fear was not justified, and in the end, over the 10-year period, we had only 20 accessory dwelling permits issued. So in 2015, the county had an affordable housing master plan that sort of rethought everything and said, you know what, we need to do something. We need to do a lot better at our accessory dwelling ordinance. We need to take another stab at it. And so over the next couple of years, we tried again. And a lot had changed in that time, I have to say. Between in between 2008 and 2017, two big trends started happening that probably are happening in other places around the state. One was that the McMansionization, I guess, the knockdown phenomenon was really hitting its stride. And what I mean by that is the older, smaller homes were being replaced with much larger homes. The people who had originally said, no, we don't want accessory dwellings because they're going to change our neighborhoods, saw that their neighborhoods were changing anyway. And they were changing in a way that was not something that they felt like they could do something about, and we're not gonna help people stay in those neighborhoods. So, and a lot of those same people who were against accessory dwellings the first time around were older now and probably saw a little bit more of the benefits of having some accessory dwellings. And then the other big trend that started happening was the Airbnb phenomenon started happening. And so those people who were afraid of strangers being in their neighborhoods, well, that was happening anyway. And Arlington did allow Airbnbs. We have an ordinance. We were one of the first in the state to have an ordinance allowing them and specifically regulating them. And so, you know, if we're going to allow and have Airbnbs, then why not allow people to use the same spaces for long-term rentals? It became really important to address that inequity that was going on. And so there was a lot more support in 2017 to fix and get rid of some of those really restrictive rules that we had in place, and we did. And the one thing that we couldn't tackle right away in 2017 was the detached structures. It took another 2 years. The county board pushed it off and said, no, we're not satisfied with your proposal for detached structures. Take another look at it. And we did. So, you know, continuing to have all these working groups and meetings. And eventually in 2019, we did allow new construction of detached accessory dwellings with a 5-foot setback. I would say that was the big issue, was how far from the property line and a detached structure could be. I'm curious what Max's is, what the rules there are in DC. So that was the evolution of Arlington's ordinance. We're there in a happy place right now, but it took us a while to get there. And so what's happening now is really interesting. So here's the 2009 to 2017, the 20 units that were permitted. And these are permits, not actual units on the ground, by the way. Things started picking up. So after that first round of revisions, we had 9 in 1 year. The next year we had 23 in 1 year. And then this year we're on pace to potentially double that again. And what's been happening that's really interesting with regard to the detached units is what I call a cottage industry. All of these companies have started popping up, and this is really interesting. So you see some examples here: backyard homes, backyard cottages, urban cottage. These companies that are pre-designing, like Max said, pre-designing ADU models, and then having homeowners just be able to go shopping for an ADU and say, I want that one, put it in my backyard. That's trying to streamline and reduce the cost of producing these and putting them in people's yards. And they've been, they have, you know, quite attractive designs. People can see what they are doing. We are still in the process of getting some of those. I believe that we have 1 or 2 on the ground right now, and a lot in process. So, so that's sort of an exciting thing that's happening here. There's also a couple other really interesting companies that are getting involved in this. A group called Add Up in DC, and a group called Symbium out of California that is helping jurisdictions streamline the sort of, not the permitting per se, but the feasibility process for accessory dwellings. Now, another big thing that's happening, and I'll finish with this, is that during this last couple of years, the state got involved and accessory dwellings, because one of the other things that was happening in that 10-year period when we only had 20 ADUs is the only things that were allowed were internal ADUs. And an internal ADU, according to the building code, creates a what the building code refers to as basically a 2-unit structure, or essentially a duplex. And that was requiring the creation of full fire separation, separating out the utilities, separate HVAC, separate everything. And it was an extremely expensive process on a retrofit basis to go through to take an old home, an old basement, and get it up to speed with the building code. And so that is the International Residential Code. That's what's typically required. Different localities interpret it differently. But we said, I was part of a DHCD working group that said that we would like to do something about that. So we are at the tail end of a process where this fall we expect a proposal to move forward at the state level that will change the way the building code works. And instead of making it a full fire separation situation, they will allow not full fire separation in exchange for a very fancy fire alarm system. So this was a consensus process that a lot of the fire and building code officials in the state worked together to put together. And then, I'll finish up, I'm out of time, but there was a bill that was put forward in the General Assembly last year by Delegate Samira. It actually got 19 co-sponsors to require communities in the state of Virginia to zone for ADUs. So if that comes back again next year, then many more communities will be dealing with this great opportunity. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, I'll start sharing my screen now. All right, can you guys see that? Yep, okay, cool. Hey y'all, my name is Nicole. I'm the Executive Director of Community Powered Workshop, as Bob introduced me earlier. We are a nonprofit design and planning organization based in Austin, Texas. We work alongside communities to create equitable and powerful places, and we do this through community engaged design, social impact design, and collaborative planning. One of our primary programs is the Alley Flat Initiative, which is why I'm here today. We have been working on the Alley Flat Initiative since 2006, since our organization was also founded. And this program started as a collaboration between our organization, the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation, and the University of Texas Center for Sustainable Development, which is based in the School of Architecture. And this program really started as kind of a design research program, looking specifically at the need to increase access to income-restricted, affordable housing in central neighborhoods around downtown, as well as curbing the displacement pressure that existing lower-income homeowners were experiencing in those neighborhoods. And I know that Max gave a little bit of an introduction into what exactly, materially an ADU is, but just a little overview of what it is in Austin. In our city, an ADU can only be detached. Our units tend to be between 400 and 1,000 square feet, 0 bedrooms to 2 bedrooms. Our program specifically, the Alley Flat Initiative, we utilize that program to layer affordable housing development incentives that are provided by our city's Neighborhood Housing Community Development Department, as well as technical assistance from our organization as planners and architects to make the development process faster and easier for homeowners and nonprofit developers to navigate. And we do this with the goal of securing affordable rental rates for the units for at least 5 years after they are built. We're also very active in advocating for policy and regulatory changes that make it easier for both affordable income restricted units and market rate units to be built across the city. And here are a couple photos of what this looks like on the ground here in Austin. These are pictures of 4 units that we've built over the last 15 years. Some of them are with homeowners, some of them are built by community development corporations, so they have a longer income restriction. And these units really house families of all types. We have had 4-person households in these units before, and 850 square feet. And they're really attractive because they are located in neighborhoods where it would otherwise be very difficult for a household making 80% median family income, which is our affordability cap. It would be almost impossible for families making that much to live in these neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods are also places where they're exhibiting indicators of gentrification, and homeowners are facing this displacement pressure and looking to generate a secondary source of income by renting their unit. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't think your slides are advancing. Just wanted to let you know.
No.
We're still on the first one. Thanks.
I wonder why. Huh. I'm not quite sure what to do about that. Let me stop and share it again, maybe. Is that any different? Yeah, you can see some pretty pictures now. All right, cool. Well, here's some pictures of what these units look like. We've got 2-story, 1-story, and we really work with we work with the homeowners pretty closely on designing units. We do have a design catalog that we work through sometimes, that we've developed some sort of standard designs that can fit on a standard size lot. But what we've found in most cases is when a homeowner gets to a point where they're really ready to build this thing, they kind of have an idea of how it should look and function in their backyard, and they have an image already, and we try to achieve that vision with them in an affordable way. Did the slide advance now? Yeah, okay, cool. Well, this is the last slide. So I just wanted to, the program has popped up a lot in a lot of places, especially nationally, as cities are looking at ADUs as an affordable housing solution. And I just wanted to give some time to look at the obstacles that we have faced over the last 15 years. This program really started as a design solution to a design problem. How do you build a small, affordable home that fits in a backyard? But through the operating of this program on the ground, it's became very apparent that this is a very complex issue that crosses over into public policy, into financial systems and development regulation, and neighborhood character, and all of these things. And so over time, we've sort of come to understand these challenges into 3 different buckets, because it's nice to be able to have 3s. And the first one is really about the freedom of the design of the unit. So we've seen a lot of development regulations that limit the design solutions that are possible, including where the unit can be on the lot, how parking requirements, the size of the unit, where the door is, like things like that make it really challenging to deal with an existing site with trees and existing structure and topography and all of those things. And then, of course, we've also seen land development policies that limit where these units can be built, what neighborhoods they can be in, what types of lots they can be on, how many can be on a lot, all of these things that I'm sure a lot of other cities are dealing with as well. Yeah, as Max went through very painfully, the process of developing a unit can be very challenging, especially for a homeowner that's not a professional development. We've seen the policies that regulate these types of developments are unclear, especially when it comes to utility requirements. The permitting process is very difficult to navigate and can take a really long time. And for homeowners who are not housing family members in their ADU, the prospect of being a landlord and operating a rental unit can also be very overwhelming for folks. And then the last category is a big one. It's feasibility. And this for us includes the high cost of building the unit. Even though it's small, it still has a bathroom and a kitchen and utilities and a roof and all these things that make it expensive. You also have to pay for professional fees. You have to get a surveyor, an engineer, structural engineer, depending on what the permitting process is like in your municipality, and then permit fees are expensive. We are able, fortunately, through our program to access permit fee waivers, but that's still a very small part of the overall cost of building the unit itself. We've also seen a lot of homeowners face a challenge in getting financing, especially if they're needing to use the rental income generated through the ADU as a qualification for the loan. A lot of loan products don't allow for that. And especially when we're looking at this as an anti-displacement strategy, the lower income homeowners that we're working with just don't qualify for the standard loan products out there that aren't really built for ADUs. And then we've also seen that property tax appraisals can be a big issue, that they can be unpredictable, and that unpredictability can make it really difficult to make rational financial decisions about this big investment that they're making. So through our program, we've sort of chipped away at some of these obstacles over the years and are still chipping very actively. A couple of things that we've done, we've worked to amend the Austin's ADU ordinance to provide more flexibility in where they're allowed and how they're built, and the requirements for parking and size and things like that. Our ADU ordinance changed in 2015 to allow them to be in a lot more places. We also work alongside city policymakers and staff to develop more calibrated incentive programs to provide additional entitlements and ease the permitting process for income restricted units specifically, while also incentivizing the preservation of the existing front house. And we have advocated for the availability of public funds and financial tools to assist the development of affordable ADUs and to combat displacement pressure lower income homeowners are experiencing. And here is my contact information. I'm sure that will be shared after the webinar as well, but I'll pass it on to Christina to wrap things up. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Hi there. Like Bob mentioned, I lost power at my house this morning, so I think they're going to be sharing the slides, and hopefully no one calls me during this. If they do, apologies. So my name is Christina Stacy. I'm an economist and a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute in Washington, D.C. But I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm currently working with the City of Alexandria to undertake a community engaged study to help design an ADU regulation for the city. So you heard some great examples all the way down from Max, who has built his own ADU, to some examples from specific cities. I'm gonna take a step back and talk about cross cities, what we're seeing across the US, and talk a little bit about the research on ADUs, specifically focused on equity implications in their regulation design. Next slide. Thanks. So as many of you know, I'm sure the US is facing a housing affordability crisis that predated the current pandemic we're in. This is a map some of my colleagues at the Urban Institute made, which is an interactive map that shows you the number of affordable units available per 100 extremely low income renter households. The lighter blue here shows a greater shortage of affordable units. So in 2018, there was a shortage of more than 7.2 million rental homes that were both affordable and available to extremely low income renter households. And this isn't an anomaly centered in big coastal cities like some might think. Every state and large metropolitan region has had a housing shortage for ELI renters in 2018. And while we don't yet know what the full effects will be of the coronavirus pandemic on rental prices, incomes, or housing affordability, we know that the starting point was a massive, massive shortage in affordable housing. Next slide. So ADUs could help address this housing crisis by increasing housing supply without changing the nature of neighborhoods and cities. ADUs have frequently been viewed as providing a more affordable alternative to expensive, large, traditional multifamily rental units. One study found that ADUs rented for 6% less than non-secondary units. And according to a study in Oregon, 13% of ADUs were rented for no money and 7% were rented at $500 or less. Another study in Canada found that 25% of ADUs were rented at under $500, and this is comparable and often exceeds common inclusionary zoning affordability goals of 10 to 30% of units rented at affordable rates. Next slide. So there are many potential benefits of ADUs, like you've already heard. Some, just a few, include creating additional homes in areas that need greater supply, offering a wealth building opportunity for homeowners, creating more inclusive communities, which benefits the local economy. Employers need employees in service industry and other jobs, and creating opportunities to age in place or live with family members. Next slide. However, like we've heard in the prior presentation, cost, restrictive regulations, confusing permitting processes, and a lack of awareness have led to few ADUs developed in many cities. This is just an example list of cities. There are many more. But in Bloomington, Minnesota, for example, which in some ways could be seen as similar to Alexandria, so we've been looking at cities that are similar. It's a suburb of Minneapolis, and there was only one permit for an ADU between 2009 and 2020. And even in the cities on this list with the highest rate of ADU development, like Portland and San Francisco, ADUs account for only 0.2 and 1.2% of the overall housing stock. So this is really just gentle density. Next slide. So cities regulate ADUs differently. In some cities, ADUs are allowed by right, like we heard people mentioning, and I'll go into more detail in these in the next slide on what these mean. But that pretty much means that the approval process is unified and consistent, making it faster and more predictable. Other cities require limited or full review. So Arlington, Boulder, San Francisco, Portland, and DC are by right, whereas Bloomington is not and requires a review before an ADU is allowed. Some cities don't require a minimum lot size for ADUs, such as Portland and Bloomington, while others don't allow ADUs on lots smaller than a specific square footage, like in Arlington, which limits ADUs to lots larger than 4,200 square feet. Some cities have owner occupancy requirements that require the owner of the property to live either in the main home or the ADU, like in Arlington and Boulder, while others have no occupancy requirements, such as San Francisco and Portland. Some cities require ADUs to have an off-street parking spot for the ADUs, while others don't. And then some cities allow short-term rentals, while others have limitations on whether or not short-term rentals are allowed and for how long. Next slide. So one of the key components that's been mentioned a few times of an ADU regulation that it can affect the ease of developing one is the review process. Some cities require conditional or discretionary review, which requires an application for permission to build an ADU with no guaranteed approval. So this process might involve neighborhood hearings, written justifications, and public weigh-in. And this can cost between $1,000 and $30,000 for site plans, land use attorneys, and fees, and you might get to the end and not be allowed to do it. So this adds time and uncertainty to the process. Some cities have found alternatives by having conditional or discretionary review, alternatives to this as having by right development, like I mentioned. And also another key component is having a really quick and easy process at the very beginning when I'm first thinking about building an ADU of whether or not I'm allowed to have one on my lot at all. So streamlining that process is also quite important. Next slide. Another key component of ADU regulations that can affect equity in ADU development are minimum lot sizes. So these allow ADUs only on lots of at least a certain size, and this can lock lower income homeowners out of the market for ADUs and may allow ADUs only in areas with lower demand that are less walkable and further from transit. Next slide. Size limits can also have equity implications on ADU development. They limit the size of an ADU based on a definitive size or proportional to the main size of the home. So this can limit ADU options for people with disabilities or those with children, and limits based on the proportion of the main home can lock less wealthy homeowners with smaller homes out of the market. So there's really kind of two equity pieces to this. There's the equity for who is able to build an ADU, and then there's also the equity implications of what the rental prices of the ADUs and whether they're affordable. Some ADU, another regulation that kind of, oh sorry, next slide. get used to this. Another regulation that can affect equity and just ADU development more broadly are owner occupancy requirements. So these, they vary from city to city, but generally they require the owner to either live in the ADU or the main home. And this can make financing more difficult if you have this requirement on the home. It's sometimes harder to sell, harder to get financing for it. It can reduce flexibility for the homeowner if they have a sudden change of employment or another life change that requires them to move quickly. They don't have the option to rent out both of the homes, the home and the ADU. Next slide. Off-street parking is another hot topic with ADU regulation and development. Off-street parking requirements, they often require the ADU developer to provide a specified number of off-street parking spots for the ADU. This can make it difficult or impossible for small lot owners to build an ADU, and it can add $3,000 to $5,000 per spot. It also increases the impermeable surface on the lot and reduces green space. So many cities don't require off-street parking at all, and some require it only based on parking capacity on the street or for homes that aren't close to public transit. But when you do require it based on capacity on the street, any way that a city can not require a review to have that happen can really help streamline the process as well. Next slide. Short-term rental regulation is also another key topic discussed when developing these regulations that can have impacts on ADU development. So these limit the use of ADUs for things like Airbnbs, and it can limit the flexibility appeal for homeowners and make it difficult to finance ADUs in the short term. So alternatives to outright banning short-term rentals are to waive fees for units that aren't going to use them as short-term rentals, or to cap the number of days an ADU can be used as a short-term rental, or just making the regulation the same as for other similar properties in the city. If single-family homes that are being rented don't have short-term rental restrictions, then a city could consider making that standardized across ADUs as well. Next slide. Another regulation that's important for equity and ADU development are the setback requirements. So these require an ADU to be built a specific distance from the edge of a property. This has already been mentioned a few times. And this can also have equity implications. Large setback requirements can make it difficult or impossible for ADUs to be built in neighborhoods that are walkable with smaller lots, and can again lock lower income homeowners out of the market of developing ADUs. Next slide. Hookup and development fees. This is also a really big, important piece that cities should think about. They can be prohibitively expensive and can range from anywhere from $10,000 to $60,000 just to get the ADU hooked up. So some cities have waived these fees outright. Sometimes they do it in exchange for affordability requirements for affordable rents for a certain amount of time. And other cities have found ways to reduce these fees by allowing ADUs to share sewer and water lines with existing houses, like I think Max's is. Next slide. And so I saw somebody asked in the question and answer box about financing, and it's been mentioned a couple times, but I'm just going to go into a little more detail here about this. So while good zoning regulation can lay the groundwork for ADU development, financing is still a huge hurdle, and it's really the biggest hurdle often for first-time and low and moderate income developers. So ADU construction usually requires homeowners to find a special line of credit or financing, but most banks don't have products that suit the needs of an ADU development. So the current tools available to homeowners who need capital for ADU construction consist of home equity lines of credit. So HELOCs are common. They leverage the homeowner's existing equity. However, HELOCs only consider the current value of the home and not the value of the home, including the ADU. So they may be too small to cover the cost of development. Another downside of HELOCs is that they're often variable rate mortgages and they require high credit scores to access. So again, that could have equity implications. Another option for interested developers is cash out refinancing. This allows the borrower to tap into the equity of their existing home as well, but again, does not consider the future value of the home with the ADU. And both HELOCs and cash out refis, they may not be feasible for middle and lower income homeowners that do not have much equity in their home yet. So again, this can be challenging. This can create a barrier for lower income folks to build ADUs. So renovation financing that would account for the after value of the home, including the ADU, would be a great option for homeowners, but it's really not often offered by banks in areas where ADUs are not already common. So working with banks to try to create some innovative financing options for ADU developers would be a really helpful thing to do in the market. Next slide. So overall, ADUs offer benefits and promise to homeowners by helping them build wealth and subsidize their mortgages. But the benefits might not reach all populations without intentional targeting. So innovative financing solutions and programs are needed to ensure that middle income and lower income homeowners can benefit from ADU development, and so that ADUs can work as an anti-displacement measure. And in addition, in order for ADUs to increase the supply of affordable rental units, the regulations have to be designed in such a way as to minimize the barriers to development. By right development, limited requirements for parking and short-term rentals, and limited setbacks and size requirements can help to ensure that ADUs lead to an increase in the housing supply. Next slide. So that's it. Here's my contact information as well, if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Back to you, Bob. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Tina, I'm slightly discouraged after hearing all of those barriers that exist out there, from financing to cost to parking, etc. But it sounds like localities are finding interesting ways to get around those and make the potential for ADU development more equitable and more available to all. We've got a few questions that have been asked, but I'm going to take the prerogative of being the moderator here by asking a couple of my questions first. And so one of those is, and this just occurred to me, Tina, when you were talking about cost. Have any of you had any experience with manufactured units being used for ADUs? That it seems like there's promise there, partly just for cost reasons, but also because of the difficulty of mobilizing construction on a very tiny site. Of course, there's a whole new set of issues with bringing a manufactured unit into a tight neighborhood with a lot of constraints in terms of movement. But any of you have any experience with that, or heard, have any comments, positive, negative? And I think okay, Max, we'll do the hand raise. Raise your hand and then unmute yourself and go ahead, Max.
Awesome. Yeah, so actually my ADU in my backyard was in fact a manufactured home. So it was, we worked with a company called Studio Shed, which I think is actually, since they were not really working in DC, it was mostly a Colorado and West Coast company, and they did, you know, little backyard offices and things like that, but they have increasingly been getting into the ADU space, and that's exactly how we did it for our backyard. They don't do any, the problem is a lot of these companies, most of the companies that kind of do the whole thing are West Coast based, because the legislation is more favorable there, like California, the whole state lets you do that kind of stuff. But on the East Coast, you're kind of limited so far to just working with a company, designing the unit. They won't work with you on permits locally because they're not familiar with the legislation. But they will deliver it to you and work with a local contractor to install it, kind of in panels. So you're not using a crane to plop it into place.
Yeah, that's great. I was just going to add, at a higher level, I don't have direct experience with that, but I know for ADUs and for affordable housing development more broadly, that manufactured housing offers great promise for being able to lower the labor costs. So if things can be developed in areas that have lower labor costs, like I know there's a factory in Pennsylvania that's creating multifamily affordable housing units. If you can move some of that labor cost off-site, then it can lower the cost overall of development. Of course, I have to point out the irony of one of the reasons why labor costs for construction in areas like Alexandria are so high is because of a lack of affordable housing. So it's such cyclical reason of why this is happening, but anywhere we can break that cycle makes sense. So there's a lot of promise and promise for manufactured housing.
We've explored a couple of these kinds of options through our program. We partnered with a company that was trying to make shipping container ADUs for a while, and we also looked at producing our own manufactured unit. And I agree that there is promise, and this idea comes up a lot. We have not seen the cost savings yet. And I think that depends on the uptake of this option. We just haven't found the cost savings that we would potentially be able to get would require us to do such a volume at the same time that it just we haven't seen that as a feasible option yet for an infill housing tool like this. So.
And the last thing I'll say is that here in Virginia, I know that, and Bob knows this, he might even be able to add to it. Virginia Housing, VHGA, has been working with some providers of container homes and trying to get a container home factory or system here in Virginia so that we can sort of bring that capacity locally. I think definitely when it comes to manufactured or even the containers, having that capacity locally is something that's really important, but they can't build that capacity until there's enough demand to make use of the factories and the systems that they create so that they can get the economies of scale as well. I know that one of the pre-designed providers that is working in Arlington is working with a modular developer called Urbaneer that's working on a lot of modularized internal spaces for ADUs. I don't know how many of those have actually been done, but the other thing, and I think in DC, Max may be able to speak to this, the container homes for ADUs have actually been more common in DC. I don't know how that's going.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Generally, so recently, at least when I was looking at doing ADUs, building ours in 2018, when I was really exploring the process, I would just get constant, whenever I'd reach out to companies, it was like, nope, will not work in DC. And DC is kind of a weird situation because it's not, there's not a lot of incentive to try to serve a jurisdiction that's not Maryland or Virginia. It's its own sort of weird quasi city-state sort of. So rather than working in a jurisdiction like California or a state like California where it's pretty streamlined across the board. But recently, some of the a former group of folks who had like a tiny home community illegally in DC have moved more in that direction actually, and have worked with some companies, one of which is doing shipping containers.
Okay, let me move to some of the questions that have been asked. The first one, and Max, I think this came up in your presentation, if I'm not mistaken, but the question here is, and I think it refers to the size restrictions in the district, 750 square feet or 35% of total. And I guess the question is, that 35% of total, is that a reference just to the front house, or is it a reference to the total square footage of both structures at the time of completion?
Yeah, that's generally, in DC, it's just a reference to the main house. So it's, they do have, DC's restrictions are challenging, but I mean, the fact that I was able to build my ADU on my lot, which is really small, it's 100 feet deep and like 25 feet wide. So it's effectively like a classic row house lot, but because it doesn't, it really depends on if you have alleys, if you have like driveways, if you have side setbacks and things like that. But generally, DC is pretty good. I ran into a problem with a side setback because the legislation was a little unclear in terms of placement. But yeah, so my unit is 280 square feet. DC doesn't specify a minimum, but that based on the building code effectively is the minimum that they will let you build. And in DC, it's depending on the zoning class. I think we were actually maxed out at like 550 square feet for our parcel. So you really, like if we wanted to build the same footprint but double it, it would have been too big. So it's a very tight, small frame that you can work with.
So the 35% of total and 750 square feet, that's an Arlington rule that is also common in other places. And in our case, the 35% of total refers to 35% of the total combined square footage of the two. And the idea there is that the accessory dwelling remains an accessory to the main structure. So the closer it gets to half of the main structure size, the more you're dealing with more of a duplex kind of situation, in which case it requires different types of regulations, different financing, et cetera. So the idea was to try to keep the accessory dwellings truly accessory to the main structures, and that is one of the types of rules that they put in place to do that.
Okay, this one is for any of the panelists. How did you tackle NIMBYism? Did you give consideration to which neighborhoods ADUs were built in? Did you factor in equity, racial makeup of neighborhoods, density, home values, et cetera? A number of you have kind of touched on this, but this issue of NIMBYism and community opposition, I think, is a key one here. Maybe Nicole, without putting you on the spot, your organization is really focused on that, on community engagement. And so could you just say a few words about, was NIMBYism an issue in Austin? How did you work through that, or what were the challenges and what solutions did you find?
Yeah, there's certainly been opposition to increasing any density in single family neighborhoods in Austin, throughout the lifespan of the city. And our city does have quite the history of segregation and racism in its policies. And, I think all cities are sort of struggling with that right now, of course, and have been for a long time and will continue to. Our organization, the way that we generally approach these kinds of community conversations is to really try to build relationships with folks on the ground and to understand what concerns really are and where they're coming from, and try to come up with a solution that is owned and supported by the community. So we work really closely with our neighborhood-based partners to develop our program and to add these kinds of other features like financing and things like that, really based on the lived experience of trying to build this ADU and the lived experience of experiencing this displacement pressure and really understanding what might be able to help. And an ADU definitely will not be a tool for everybody, but it is one important tool that some people would be very greatly helped by. So, I mean, generally we try not to get into a polarizing battle about, NIMBY versus not NIMBY and things like that, because we don't find it to be super productive as far as coming up with solutions that really help people. But we do a lot of education, a lot of outreach. We host alley flat tours when we're not in a pandemic, where people can come and see, often ADUs that are around the corner and have been there for 10 years and they never even knew they existed, and try to use that as a way to sort of build community around this type of housing and try to just sort of like demystify and debunk some of the assumptions that people might make around what the units look like, who might be living in them, and where they are most appropriate. And that's sort of been our strategy over the long term. And Austin generally has changed a lot over the last 15 years. And I think a lot more people are recognizing the true affordable housing crisis that we are in, and the need for a diverse housing options in the city, and that there are a lot of ways that we need to tackle this problem. There's not going to be one way to solve it. And I think more and more, homeowners and advocates and neighborhood leaders are seeing ADUs as a solution for themselves, even that could help them. And that's been really transformative in being able to personalize that story a little bit and solution for people.
Any other, Max?
Yeah, so I, as a homeowner, I can kind of try to answer that question from my own perspective. And so for some more context, where I live in the District of Columbia is in Southeast DC, and because it's a place where my husband and I could afford in the district to buy an actual house. And it is one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in terms of displacement for the increasing rising value of housing stock in the district and the region. And something that I found that was really interesting is when I dug into the DC legislation initially, it was really depending on purely based on legislation, as well as the way that the local Office of Planning, or DCOP, was framing this legislation, was really geared towards higher income DC neighborhoods, convincing them to build them for a variety of reasons, but to make them pretty and cute and, kind of like a additional kind of, wouldn't that be kind of nice sort of thing. But really, I think that the teeth and the real power of ADUs in the district are actually in the neighborhoods that I'm living in. That, we were able to get the price down to a price that would be still tough for a lot of the folks who live in our neighborhood. But I must say, in terms of NIMBYism, or not my backyard, we did not run into a single objection within our neighborhood. It was almost exclusively positive. Our neighbors, in fact, to this day, are like constantly socially distanced, or constantly knocking on our door asking to take a look at the unit in the back because they want to do it themselves. So it really flipped the script from what I think people wouldn't typically think of, or planning practitioners classically consider.
A number of you have referenced financing. One of the questions here is, how are homeowners financing ADUs? Any of you have any further thoughts on financing? I think it is one of the challenges because, as we've all noted, these are not inexpensive to build, so financing is critical. Any other thoughts on that, Tina?
I was just going to add that one thing I didn't mention is a lot of people in reality, because of the lack of, formal financing mechanisms, are using things like friend and family loans, savings to get started on building their ADUs. And I just wanted to, since I feel bad that I left on a discouraging note in my presentation, point out that the author of Backdoor Revolution, Cole Peterson, it's a book out of Portland. He's an expert on ADUs. He lives in his ADU. He has a great quote in it that says, like, out of the hundreds of ADU developers he's worked with, he's never met one that had financial regrets about developing their ADU. So while it can be challenging, and while I think there's still, I think I would see it as opportunity for banks to really get in this market, and for people to work with banks to try to come up with innovative financing, or nonprofits or whoever, CDFIs, to come up with innovative financing mechanisms. Even though it's tough, it seems like it really is beneficial in the end.
Right, Michelle?
Yeah, and I'll just say that, it depends a lot on the financial situation of the owner who is putting the unit in. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've heard about is when somebody is really going to be depending on that income from the ADU to qualify for their mortgage, getting that to work has been the most difficult. And whether it's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and not encouraging that or not allowing that. I think on the positive side, and I don't know where this is going necessarily right now, but Freddie Mac just did a major data analysis, major study of accessory dwellings around the country, released in the last 2 weeks. And so that tells me that they are taking a look at them. Usually when you see a study like that, it means that they've got some sort of some work going on to think about how they could potentially support them. And so helping, adjust their policies to encourage or allow the use of that ADU income to help qualify would be very, very, very helpful.
So Michelle, this is a question about whether Arlington's success with this program, what spillover there's been to other jurisdictions, specifically the questioner was asking about these startup companies that focus on ADUs. Are they working in other jurisdictions as well, or?
They do, and I think these have started to pop up once there was more than sort of 1 or 2 jurisdictions in our area that were doing these, the market became more favorable for these companies. And so I think the ones that work in Arlington also work in Montgomery County and some in DC. Obviously the regulatory environment's very different. And so it's, you know, easier to work in the same jurisdiction, statewide as well. But yeah, I mean, they can only work where they're allowed. So, you know, as soon as Alexandria starts allowing more, these same companies will very, very easily roll over into providing their services there.
A number of you have talked about parking in your presentations, but that is a frequent issue that arises. I know certainly the neighborhood that I work in, parking seems to rise to the top of any community conversation. Anything any of you have further to add about adventures in parking in terms of the ADU programs?
I'll just say that it was one of the areas that our regulations loosened up on. So when we first passed our rules in 2008, we had some pretty strict rules about having to survey the neighborhood for, you know, how intensely parked it was, and, you know, certain things, you know, if it was a certain amount, if the street parking was a certain amount used up, then you had to provide some off-street parking. We loosened that up quite a bit so that now essentially you just can't reduce the amount of parking that you already have on your site. If you have one or two spaces already, you can't eliminate one of them in order to build the ADU. And so I think that was very, very promising. And generally the feeling that people have about reducing the need for parking has rolled over, at least in our area, to ADUs. But definitely, I'd say parking and trees are two of the bigger, what I'll call NIMBY-like issues that we ran into. You know, where are the people going to park, and you're going to kill all the trees when you build these things. And so anything that you can do to help, you know, just, you know, make people feel better about those concerns is helpful.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, sorry, there's been at least one study that's shown that ADU owners are much less likely to own a car. So, you know, that should help a little bit with people's concerns about parking. But I also want to point out that some of the concerns that residents have, that requiring on-site parking will harm some of the other concerns about loss of green space, loss of trees. You require on-site parking, that's a lot more impermeable surface. That's, you know, potentially a big, like, instead of a front yard, a big, you know, driveway. So just thinking about the pros and cons of these different options. And just on that note, this reminds me, I wanted to point out that there have been cases of people figuring out which regulations would stop ADU development the most, whether or not they really care about that issue, and then pushing for that particular regulation so that ADUs don't get developed at all. And I'm not sure parking is one of those, but I just wanted to mention that, you know, that's another challenge in designing these regulations, is that people kind of figured out how to game that system.
I have a little bit to add to, just on top of all this. In Austin in 2015, we reduced the parking requirement for ADUs that are within a quarter mile of a transit corridor. So if you have access to public transit, then you don't need to build the parking space. And so in especially the neighborhoods close to the downtown core, there are a lot of bus lines and things like that. So there are a lot of neighborhoods that just don't require parking for the ADU. And we do see a lot of homeowners choosing not to do the parking space just to save that sort of area on their property. But we do still see a lot of people choosing to do that, either because they, you know, just don't want whoever's renting the unit in the back to park in their driveway, and, you know, they don't want to have to make them park on the street for some reason. But we also see it as for an accessibility concern as well. Our city has a visitability requirement where all new housing units need to be built so that they could be visitable by somebody with a mobility impairment. So we have to have, you know, no step entries and ramps and things like that. And then the bathroom has certain requirements. But the being able to get from wherever you park or wherever you might get out of a vehicle that is dropping you off at your home, being able to get from there to your front door could often, depending on the site conditions and the neighborhood conditions, it kind of requires you to have a parking space to sort of get out of in order to get to your front door safely and accessibly. So that's something that we've a tension that we have experienced in the past.
There's a question about just the square foot, what experience you've had with respect to the square footage of ADUs being developed. Max, how large was yours again?
So mine was on the very, very small side, 280 square feet. And in DC, it's a pretty, effectively, they have a cap for square footage if your house is massive. And 35% of that is actually more than 700 square feet or something, but it can vary a lot. And I think Michelle probably has some better feedback.
Yeah, so it depends on internal versus detached. So most of the models of the units for detached that we're seeing are a mix range somewhere between 500 and 700 because they adjust them to what is allowed, of course. But the other really interesting square footage issue that Arlington had that others might also have is that we had this 750 cap. And you might have seen something in my presentation about the basements. So that was actually causing a problem because many basements in our suburban community are actually larger than 750 square feet. So when somebody wanted to make an ADU in their basement, they had to wall off the portion of it to make it smaller than the basement itself. And that was actually a barrier for people. And so the county, instead of saying all ADUs can be bigger than that, they said, if it's in a basement, it can take up the entire basement. And then that's kind of the only case where it can be over 750 square feet. And that I think has facilitated a lot of the internal ones moving forward because the construction complexity of trying to wall off certain portion of that basement was difficult. But generally, I'd say the 5 to 6 to 700 is typical.
So there's a question that's very specific around targeting particular types of clients. This refers to permanent supportive housing, and the questioner is asking whether there's been any experience with ADUs as a solution for meeting the needs of people who need supportive services. And that could be for a variety of reasons, including frail seniors or others. Any comments on that, or have you seen anything in programs that you're familiar with that addresses that?
I haven't seen any ADU programs specifically addressing that in Austin. I have maybe heard a little bit about something like that on the West Coast, but just sort of drawing from my affordable housing advocacy background, I would think a program that would have that goal of providing permanent supportive housing would need to have some kind of public subsidy involved in building the ADU. And as far as a model for homeowners, it has been very difficult, at least for us, to be able to explore the dedication of public funds to improvements on private property. And so we have been challenged by that, but I think if there were a program that moved forward with that sort of population in mind, there would definitely need to be some subsidy dollars involved to make that work long term, I would think.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just to add to that, I haven't seen anything on permanent supportive housing, although I think there's definitely the possibility for that. But I just wanted to add that I do know that LA has partnered with developers and CDFIs to help finance and build ADUs for those who agree to rent to people with HCVs, housing choice vouchers. And then some other cities have some forgivable loan programs to rent to low-income individuals. So there's definitely examples out there of cities, CDFIs, nonprofits, developers working together to try to finance affordable homes for people with vouchers or other groups. So I think there's definitely great promise there as well for permanent supportive housing.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'll add is that, and this is not permanent supportive housing, but that Habitat for Humanity local affiliates in a couple of different places have started creating ADUs with affordability in mind, both for the owner and for the occupants.
There are a couple of questions, 3 questions really, that focus on design and very complimentary to the idea of having a set of designs that are pre-approved by the jurisdiction. There's a question about whether any of you have seen any design competitions that can help to produce units that are going to meet with higher levels of community acceptance. Any additional comments from any of you around the design of ADUs or best practices or strategies? Max?
Yeah, so generally, I always find myself saying this, but West Coast is like light years ahead of the East Coast when it comes to this. So LA has started to get more on the bandwagon with that, particularly because they have a lot of really great nonprofits like I think LA Moss has worked a lot in this particular intersection. But I think Santa Clara, California was like one of the first jurisdictions that basically has like this massive book and catalog of all the different pre-approved types of models that you can build in your backyard. They're not designed, I think, to be manufactured housing necessarily, but it's so that you could potentially skip a lot of the extra design services with an architect and kind of jump more directly to consolidate that. And that homeowners would be less likely to complain about it because theoretically it's approved.
Any other thoughts on design? So we have reached 11 o'clock. We have a number of additional questions, some of which are really great. And so we'll kind of commit to this. We'll get answers to these questions from our panelists. We'll distribute those and get the comments of panelists back on these questions that we haven't been able to get to. I see there's a number of questions here regarding VHDA financing for housing with ADUs or for ADUs themselves. There's a couple of people from VHDA I know on this call. So we'll circle up with our colleagues at VHDA and see if we can get some answers to those questions as well. But I would really like to thank our 4 terrific panelists. This has been a really good session. Tribute to you that we still have most of our participants on the call. So obviously the information has really been engaging and has addressed what people are wanting to hear about. We definitely hope that this is a help to getting more effective ADU programs implemented here in Virginia. And we thank all of our attendees so much for spending 90 minutes with us this morning. And again, we'll be posting the recorded webinar, and we'll be posting the presentations as well as answers to some of the questions that we weren't able to get to on the Housing Virginia website. And so look for that in the next few days. So thank you, everyone, and especially once again, our panelists. Christina, did you get your power back on? Yes, okay.
Yep, came back on.
Ending on a positive note there. Okay, well, thanks, everybody.